This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Not everyone is careful with your personal information, which might explain why there's a victim of identity theft every 5 seconds in the US. Fortunately, there's LifeLock. LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats to your identity. If your identity is stolen, a US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year by visiting lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hey, it's Mandy Moore.
Sterling K. Brown.
And Chris Sullivan from That Was Us.
Spring is finally here. And if you're like us, you're looking for little ways to bring new energy into your home, starting with your bed.
I love everything about Brooklinen. I love the variety of colors. I love the texture. I love the coolness up against my skin. I'm a man who runs hot. These sheets keep your boy cool, and I love them.
Brooklinen makes it so easy to refresh your space with layers that feel light, breathable, and so comfortable. Finding sheets you love can be tricky, but Brooklinen nails it every time.
Brooklinen offers so many different tones and textures, which is great, since new colors can make your bedroom feel fresh and inviting. Plus, their lightweight, airy fabrics are perfect for sun-kissed mornings and cozy nights.
And the best part? Brooklinen has everything you need, from soft sheets to the perfect throw blankets to style and layer your bed effortlessly.
It's no wonder they have over 100,000 five-star reviews. People love them. So if you're ready to refresh your space, now is the time.
Shop award winners and fan faves in-store and online at brooklinen.com. That's BROOKLINEN.com. Get 15% off your first order today.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by Professor of Law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin.
Hey, Michael, it's great to be back with you.
Yeah, it's something we don't get to do a whole lot, and I am definitely looking forward to it. But before we do get going, I want to thank some new supporters, or actually not all new supporters. There's Andrew, who's a longtime supporter who recently increased his level of support, as well as Robert, who is a new yearly Patreon supporter, and Paisley, who's supporting us through a monthly donation in PayPal, which is a thing you can do. So thanks, guys, so much. We really do appreciate that. And before we get going with what I thought was going to be our main story, well, Ken, you suggested that we talk about this, and I think it's a good idea because weirdly, this is the first week in a long time where there was at least one day where the big story wasn't Donald Trump, which has to be galling for him. But let's at least talk a little bit about the American Pope. How weird. So what do you think, Ken?
Yeah. Well, it's more than one day, because I think today I'm looking right now at the New York Times. It's still every top headline is about the Pope. And now actually there's a new one. You might not have seen this yet, but Justice David Souter just died as well. So that's getting up to the top of the yeah. But yeah, an American Pope, I think, is a big deal. There's never been one. Of course, Francis was the first one from this hemisphere, from South America. Right. So there hasn't been, and now Leo the 14th will be the first one from North America. There hasn't yet been one from Canada or Mexico. But I think that there was, I think that for a lot of reasons, the church for a long time was hesitant about having an American Pope, in part because America was such a superpower, at least since World War II, that I think they always wanted to, be a little bit of a counterweight to that. But now I guess my take on it is that the time was right, because Pope Francis was one of the more liberal popes, at least in modern times. The U.S. Catholic Church is probably about the most right-wing Catholic Church of any major country. It may be the most right-wing Catholic Church on earth. I'm not certain about that, but certainly of major countries. And there was, I think, real threat of a schism that the church would have perceived, that the American church was moving farther and farther away from the church in Rome. And of course, America is the primary source of funding that comes to the Vatican as well. So that would have been a schism that would have been particularly painful. for the church. And I feel like this was a very political move to try to take as I read it, an American pope who is probably more aligned with Francis than with the American church, and who, even though he is American, he was most of his career was not part of the American church, but is a little bit to the center right compared to where Francis was. So it's a step in the direction of the American church, but not a huge step in that direction. And that it would just be not a time that people would be talking about schism here as much, while there's an American pope. So that was kind of my take on what was going on.
Well, I mean, I guess apparently, according to, I think it's Laura Loomer, we now have a woke Marxist pope. So, who would have thought it, right? So,
yeah, I don't think he's as woke or as Marxist as his predecessor, though. And in fact, on one of what I would take would be Laura Loomer's big issues, the LGBTQ stuff. He seems more, less tolerant than Francis, I would say.
Yeah, I would think so. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, especially after J.D. Vance killed the old pope. So it's, but the new pope's got plenty of stuff on his plate. And I kind of feel for him because it's clearly he's had a rough life. I mean, my God, he's a White Sox fan, and I wouldn't wish that on hardly anyone.
That's right. And all the memes are, that's what the White Sox need. If they not even God on their side may be enough, right?
Exactly.
But, I think another interesting thing about this Pope, especially from the Laura Loomer perspective, I did manage to look up his voting records, and in Illinois, people don't register with a party. They can take whichever primary they want, but it does become a public record which primary they voted in. And he was voting fairly regularly through 2016. He never voted again after the 2016 election. Of course, we don't know how he voted in the general elections, but I can say I discovered that every primary that he ever voted in was a Republican primary. And that might be contrary to what some people are thinking right now.
Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed that either. So, but it's I think, like I said, a little bit of, I see it as sort of good news, because I was thinking that perhaps that the church might go much more conservative than that. And I'm not exactly a Catholic. I'm a deeply lapsed Catholic. It still has its claws into me a little bit, which is what happens when you go to Catholic school, I think. So, but yeah, I certainly wish Pope Leo the best. So, all right, well, let's move on from that to what I thought. Go ahead. If you have more to say, yeah, please.
One other thing I was going to ask you to speculate about Pope Leo before we move on. Do you think he's personally acquainted with Barack Obama? I think he might be. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, given those circles and so forth. I guess I feel like in the end, the church and the sort of weight that the church carries in terms of politics is so much less than it perhaps used to be, because now for the MAGA folks, I mean, MAGA is their religion and Trump is their pope, right? And so when he posted that little meme of himself, and I mean, that's who they worship, that's who they follow, not whether it's Francis or Leo or anything like that. But to the extent that the church can make a difference in its teachings on social justice and acceptance and love and that sort of thing, hey, certainly I'll take whatever counterweights to the sort of intolerance and anti-immigrant type stances that are so prevalent in American society today, at least on the right. Yeah, and of course the new pope, was somewhat active on Twitter, right up to the time he just got named pope, and he did tweet, by name sometimes against J.D. Vance and against Trump, particularly on immigration policy. And with Vance, there was the dust up over whether Catholic teaching teaches that you're supposed to love your family more than you love people in other countries. And Vance had said yes, and the new pope had corrected him on that. But I was just thinking with Obama that the reason I said that is because this pope spent a lot of his career out of the country, but there was a little window of time when he was back in Chicago running the Augustinian order, which is a global order. He wasn't really part of the Chicago church, but he was based in Chicago. And that order was based within the South Side legislative district that Obama was then representing. So Obama would have been the state legislator whose district included the mother house of that Augustinian order. So that made me think that they might know each other, but I'm just speculating on that.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well,
okay, I'll let you move on.
Yeah, no. I think it's a fascinating story. But so yeah, let's talk tariffs, and I'll try to untangle all the things that are going on without going too long. But I think the place to start this week is with the recently announced deal between the U.S. and the U.K. And under that agreement, we still have those 10% baseline tariffs, which is up from a pre-Trump average of around 1.3%. In addition, the UK is agreeing to drop its tariffs on, U.S. beef, ethanol, some other stuff, as well as buying $10 billion worth of planes from Boeing. And at this point, it's a pretty broad framework. We have yet to see kind of the details, which will come in the coming weeks. And it's the first of what Trump has said will be a bunch of trade agreements, which are going to be, of course, fantastic. Markets were happy about at least this agreement to the extent. I mean, the UK is a significant trading partner, the 8th largest. But of course, the bigger question is what kind of deals the administration will be able to make with the rest of the world, especially the EU, which is somewhere around 18% of all U.S. trade, and China. And just earlier today, in fact, we're recording this Friday morning, President Trump floated the idea of dropping the China tariffs from the current insane 145% to a still insane 80%. And this comes just in advance of Treasury Secretary Scott Benson's meeting with his Chinese counterpart in Switzerland over the weekend for talks. Speaking of Benson, in testimony he gave to Congress this week, he said that the administration was currently negotiating with 17 other countries that have made what he termed very good offers. And he said he'd be surprised if the U.S. hadn't wrapped up 80 to 90% of those impending deals by the end of the year. And that's, of course, far fewer deals in far more time than President Trump has regularly promised. And honestly, even if the administration manages to make fantastic deals with every single country willing to accept Donald Trump's terms, there's almost certainly going to be disruptions that affect consumers because right now we're not feeling it because many companies have built up inventories in anticipation of these tariffs, as well as you have that lag time between shipping goods overseas. And so there's a months-long kind of lag. But we're starting to see that a little bit. For instance, this week, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which handle around a third of all containerized goods coming into the U.S., they reported a 44% decrease in docked vessels compared to the same time last year. And that is a big deal. We're going to feel that because it means fewer goods on the shelves, which is just about guaranteed to result in increased prices for businesses and consumers, which is, you can understand why at this point the Fed is taking a wait and see stance. This week, Chair Jerome Powell said, we're not going to change our interest rate because, in his words, there's so much uncertainty. And President Trump responded about how you'd expect. He called Powell a fool who doesn't have a clue, said there's virtually no inflation and tariff money is pouring into the U.S., neither statement of which is exactly all that factually accurate. So, Ken, that's a lot. So why don't we start with the UK deal, at least what we know of it, at least. What was your take on that?
Well, it's not much. If he's going to count that as a deal, then he probably will be able to reach his goal of getting about 15 such deals by the end of the year, because there's literally no more substance to it than, could be reported in the one-page newspaper articles reporting it. A typical trade deal would have a lot of detail on a lot of, particular goods and services. And, you named like the 3 or 4, the beef and things like that they agreed to tinker around a little bit with what the tariffs looked like, before Liberation Day. But it's, there's almost nothing in it. And it's really mainly an agreement to, negotiate a new trade deal. And it's also hard to see where there's much room to negotiate any new trade deal, because there were almost no tariffs on almost any goods or services between the U.S. and the UK before. Each of us had just a few tariffs on a few specially protected sectors. we had tariffs on things like steel and light trucks, and they had tariffs on beef, going back to when they had all the problems with mad cow disease, and they needed to revive that industry. So I think both the UK and the US had tariffs on a few protected industries, did not generally have tariffs against each other. And in fact, that's one of the countries that we were already running a trade surplus with, not a trade deficit. So I think there's almost no room, to do much of anything. And even there, they haven't really agreed to do anything other than just, to agree to keep negotiating.
Yeah, I think I agree. If the best the UK can do, one of our closest partners is that 10% baseline plus a little bit more. It's almost impossible to imagine, I think, any other significant trading partner doing any better. And that to me is a big problem. And so when I look at this, I think, well, okay, the best case scenario for me right now is there's still, I think, a not unreasonable possibility that the courts will find that Trump doesn't have the authority to impose national emergency tariffs. More remotely, maybe Congress, if the economy tanks enough, will do something, though that would require a veto-proof majority, and that's not going to happen. So I guess, it's something, but it seems to suggest to me that we're going to be dealing with a not great situation unless the courts intervene. And when I look at the various cases, I wanted to talk to you about this, because when I look at the various cases, I think the legal arguments seem to me to be at least reasonably strong. I haven't had a chance to ask you about what you think about that, and I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, I think at least some courts are going to strike down the tariffs. You may get mixed results before it gets up to the U.S. Supreme Court, but just to sort of, kind of explain the issues a little bit, most of the statutory framework that Trump has been relying on is that there are a number of different. So first of all, Congress is the branch of government with the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations. The president doesn't have that authority, but Congress, in its exercise of that authority, has passed a lot of statutes that delegate certain congressional authorities to the president. In certain situations, not all the time, but only in certain situations. So some of the trade statutes themselves give the president authority to retaliate if other countries suddenly impose tariffs on us. So that would be an authority that Congress has given to the president in advance. And he can just invoke it if the right contingencies arise, if other countries have taken actions on trade that he can respond to. Then there's other statutes. The most important one is called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That's not really a trade statute, but it allows the president to invoke authority to take trade sanctions to respond to other kinds of international emergencies, not necessarily trade-related emergencies. So, the freezing of Russian assets that's been going on since Russia invaded Ukraine, that kind of thing is done under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and that can also be used for tariffs. That's one of the kinds of economic sanctions that the president can take. So there's sort of a couple different statutory sources of authority that say if certain things happen, the president sort of already has a blank check that he can fill in to impose tariffs, either for retaliatory purposes if there's trade disputes, or as a form of sanctions if there's other kinds of international emergencies. So those are the statutes that he's been relying on, and it is certainly true that historically when you have a statute like that sort of says when certain contingencies arise, if the president makes a finding that those contingencies have arisen, then that and Congress has already given him emergency powers that he can exercise, that generally his findings will be deferred to, and the court will say, Congress, gave him this power in case of an emergency. He found the emergency. We defer to his finding, and that means that the power that he's exercising, isn't just unilateral. It's actually been delegated by Congress. So that's sort of the normal way these things go. But I think that there is some good reason to think that this situation is so abnormal that it's not going to necessarily proceed that way in court, because not only is it kind of obvious, and that there are no countries that suddenly, raised tariffs against us. And that's what he's responding to. He's starting this trade war. So the notion that this is triggered by one of the statutes that says, if a foreign country, takes some adverse trade action, imposes tariffs, something like that, the president has power to respond. There's just factually no case that ever happened. So his finding seems to me vulnerable, even under the ordinary amount of deference that he would get. It's not infinite deference. And then, on the other thing, some of the justifications he's given under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, like the reason for the trade sanction against Canada is because Canada's not doing enough to stop fentanyl from coming into the United States. Well, there is almost no fentanyl coming into the United States from Canada. In fact, there's much more going in the other direction. There's much more fentanyl that goes from the United States into Canada than from Canada into the United States. And of all the fentanyl that comes to the United States, less than 1% of it ever came through Canada. So I think those kind of facts will be difficult for him to defend in court, especially because, what you usually see, one of the reasons that the presidents usually get deferred to is that the administrations usually take care to develop a factual record so that, if there is even a conflict in the factual, if the administration develops a factual record and presents the facts that it's relying on, and a plaintiff challenges them and says, they don't have the facts right, look, these are the real facts. Typically you might have a conflict in evidence between what the plaintiffs are presenting and what the government's presenting. And the government is kind of the home team. Like they'll get a little bit of a thumb on the scale that they'll be believed. But if the administration has not even bothered to do that, then all the evidence is on the plaintiff's side, right? So when Trump says, well, we're doing this because of all the fentanyl coming in from Canada, and they've literally made no effort to even try to present documented evidence showing how much fentanyl is coming in from Canada or how that's been affected by the tariffs, then actually all the evidence is going to be on the plaintiff's side. And so I think you will have some conservative judges whose knee is just going to jerk towards saying, well, in these kind of cases, we always defer to the administration. We're just going to defer to the Trump administration now, like we always do. I think you will see that from some judges. But I think probably almost any judge that sees this case that was, appointed by a Democratic president, and some that are appointed by Republican presidents longer ago, they're all. I think there's a very high chance that they're not going to afford the usual level of deference. And similarly, the last thing I'll say, I know I've been filibustering, is I think we're seeing that in a lot of lower court cases on other subjects already. That many types of areas, immigration would be another area where the fact findings of the administration typically get an enormous amount of deference. But when they make it clear that they're, claiming deference without having actually bothered to develop a factual record, and that they're just coming in and lying, then judges are not generally going to defer to that.
Hey, it's Mandy Moore.
Sterling K. Brown.
And Chris Sullivan from That Was Us.
Spring is finally here. And if you're like us, you're looking for little ways to bring new energy into your home, starting with your bed.
I love everything about Brooklinen. I love the variety of colors. I love the texture. I love the coolness up against my skin. I'm a man who runs hot. These sheets keep your boy cool, and I love them.
Brooklinen makes it so easy to refresh your space with layers that feel light, breathable, and so comfortable. Finding sheets you love can be tricky, but Brooklinen nails it every time.
Brooklinen offers so many different tones and textures, which is great, since new colors can make your bedroom feel fresh and inviting. Plus, their lightweight, airy fabrics are perfect for sun-kissed mornings and cozy nights.
And the best part? Brooklinen has everything you need, from soft sheets to the perfect throw blankets to style and layer your bed effortlessly.
It's no wonder they have over 100,000 five-star reviews. People love them. So if you're ready to refresh your space, now is the time.
Shop award winners and fan faves in-store and online at brooklinen.com. That's BROOKLINEN.com. Get 15% off your first order today.
It's like I said, I am holding out hope, and we shall see, I guess, over the weeks to come. I guess one reason perhaps why we haven't seen any rulings, even preliminary injunctions or anything like that, is because the president put most of those tariffs on hold for 90 days. So I guess the argument would be that no one has suffered any sort of concrete injury at this point. Would that be your take, or?
Yeah, I mean, so we're going to end up talking about this with the transgender case today as well. But the standard on a preliminary injunction is different than the standard at the end of litigation. So litigation cannot move as fast. Even 90 days. I know that's a long time in the real world. That's barely a minute in litigation time, right? So to actually litigate a case to the end and get a judgment after full and fair proceedings is going to take much longer. So most of the posture that these cases are coming in on, plaintiffs could ask for preliminary injunctions where the government is enjoined from implementing a policy while the case is being litigated. But to get preliminary injunctions, not only would a plaintiff have to show a likelihood of success on the merits, but they would also have to show that they will suffer irreparable injury. And so any policy that has been announced but not implemented, it would be hard to show irreparable injury yet, because there's always the chance that during the period of time before the implementation, the administration could make changes. And so I think that's why it's harder to get an injunction. Another thing about some of the litigation, a lot of this litigation is actually being funded by Charles Koch, famously of the Koch brothers. So that's interesting too. He funded so many right-wing causes for so long, but is a never Trumper and is actually funding a significant amount of the small business litigation that's coming in against tariffs.
You mentioned speaking of legislation or policy that's been announced but not implemented. That's, of course, a famous Trump thing. He's known for that. And one of these things that we saw this week in regards to tariffs was that, I guess I won't even call it a policy announcement, kind of floating the idea. He meets with John Voight, one of his Hollywood ambassadors, so to speak, over the weekend, and then decides, well, let's put 100% tariff on movies produced, what was his phrase, in foreign lands. I love that, in foreign lands. And so, I mean, my understanding was that he met with Voight, and Voight said, well, maybe we should have some tax incentives. And of course, tax incentives would make a lot more sense, but you can't do those unilaterally. And Donald Trump loves tariffs because he thinks he can just impose any tariff on anyone at any time. And so far, no one has, said otherwise in any kind of definitive way. So I thought that was interesting. And then we saw a response from Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, who I guess found a minute to take a break from his podcasting jobs to suggest, maybe was it $7.5 billion federal tax credit for the movie and TV industry, that sort of thing. So, I mean, again, it seems to me, I want to bring this up because I feel like this proposal to me illustrates a number of key points about Donald Trump. Number one, how impressionable he is, which is not necessarily something you want. How he loves these kind of big splashy proposals that are bad ideas and unlikely to go anywhere, like, reopening Alcatraz, and how he just loves to kind of, more than anything else, to put himself in the situation of he is the one to which you have to come as a supplicant asking for his great favors, that sort of thing. I mean, that's my take on why I thought this was kind of an interesting thing. But what did you think about the potential movie tariffs from foreign lands?
Well, it's so puzzling in so many ways because, first of all, I think one of the main theories that he has articulated that underlies his idea of imposing high tariffs is that would cause industries to return to the United States. Now, Hollywood dominates the movie industry. It's in the United States. This is not like one of those manufacturing industries where all the, everything's fled overseas. Hollywood is right here, and that's where movies are primarily made. There is a little bit of a foreign movie industry as well. It has a very small market share in the United States, and Hollywood movies have a huge market share everywhere on Earth, not just in the United States. So we have a very, very favorable trade balance already with the output of Hollywood. And also all the benefits, and this would also be true of the Alcatraz proposal, if all the benefits would go to California, and that also seems kind of inconsistent with, he usually seems to want to beat up on the blue states, whereas here, he'd be putting a ton of federal money into Alcatraz to building a federal prison there, which would mostly go to California-based contractors and people like that. And then he'd be protecting Hollywood from foreign competition as if Hollywood needs it. I mean, almost every American, that goes to the movies goes to American movies. So, and it's hard to know how it would affect Hollywood to the extent that they film movies overseas. So there are plenty of Hollywood movies that are, have parts shot on location in other countries, that there's a long tradition of that. The Hollywood classic Roman Holiday with Audrey Hepburn is shot in Rome, and things like that. So I don't know how he even thinks about that. So there's all these strange things about it, and the other thing about the flightiness of it that he talks to John Voight, so suddenly there's going to be a tariff on movies. But I think the main thing about the sector by sector tariffs isn't even the flightiness; it's that it's an extortion racket, right? That he puts broad-based tariffs. And then anyone who comes and pays him bribes can get some relief. And the bribe could take the form of a cash bribe, or it could take the form of some kind of obsequiousness. TikTok, I think it was a combination of the two. That even though we've got these massive tariffs against China right now, the one and only Chinese company that Congress has actually banned and that the Supreme Court has actually sustained the ban, that's the one and only Chinese company that's operating with impunity in this country and, in violation of law and without even having to pay any tariffs, because they, visited him a few times, paid him cash bribes and also made public statements about how it was Biden that screwed this whole thing up, and thank God we have Trump in there now. And that's really all that's the kind of, I think that's the sort of primary concept here, is that it's an extortion racket, and he's extorting both political support, public statements, and actual cash out of individual industry sectors. I mean, one more example of that would be with the automobile. You might think that if there's any segment of our economy that it would be appropriate to have some tariffs, it might be our automobile industry, which really, largely can't compete with foreign competition, but there's major sunk investment in it here. But that seems to be like the one sector that he exempted largely from these tariffs, the auto parts, so that our industry can get them. And that also seems to be based on, some kind of bribes that were paid in private negotiations. So I'd say that's kind of, the flightiness is part of it. But I think the extortion racket is sort of the thread that ties it all together.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the payments, there are a lot of ways to reward the president without actually directly. It's not like people are coming in with bags of cash or anything like that, like with bars of gold or things like that. With what's his New Jersey senator? I'm blanking on the guy's name. Menendez, kind of thing. But yeah, we were gonna. We don't have the time to talk about this. We decided not to. But the whole crypto thing kind of, I think, connects into that. But to me, on the Hollywood thing, the main party that might be hurt by this is Canada, because a lot of major studio films are filmed in Canada because of their tax incentives. It's a lot cheaper to do it in places like Vancouver and so forth like that. And so a lot's filmed there. But to me, it's just another incoherent proposal, or largely incoherent proposal. And that got me thinking. I'm sure a lot of folks have, and this is going to sound like a non sequitur in a way, but it's not. I promise I'll tie it together. There was a big story this week about people worrying about Senator Fetterman's mental health, right? That he's just kind of gone off the reservation and God knows what's going on. And it got me thinking that, that we had these talks about Biden being so old and out of it, that kind of thing. And people pointing to his interview this week saying that he's, refuses to face reality about why Harris lost and whatever. But I think you can maybe make the same case for Donald Trump. I mean, to me, he seems even more erratic than he was in his first term, which is, really saying something. And also, I would argue that it's even harder to evaluate any sort of loss in function from someone like Donald Trump, because he's never really demonstrated any concern for facts or an ability to focus or present a coherent narrative, right? He does the weave. And so if he is descending into some sort of dementia sort of state, well, that would be a lot harder to spot, I would think. And I mean, I'm not, it sounds funny, but in a way it's not, because my God, if you have it's one thing if John Fetterman is, maybe out of it, but if Donald Trump, who wants to remake the entire federal government and our entire trade system, is not very sharp and can be so easily influenced by TikTok people saying, "Oh, you're wonderful," or John Voight saying, "Hey, you should do something to help us out." That's a big problem. And, I wonder if a lot of Republicans or Congressers are looking and thinking, well, my God, this guy is really just out of it. But what the hell are we going to do?
Well, I said that back during the campaign. I never saw any evidence that Biden was any further into dementia than Trump was. In fact, right at the time during the campaign, I thought it looked the opposite way to me, that even though Biden did have problems getting words out of his mouth, which was a lifelong problem for him. He was always a stutterer and a stammerer and someone given to misstatement. That seemed to be the only evidence of, when people were saying he was falling into senile dementia. I mean, his administration was firing on all cylinders, and the only indication that he had any mental diminishment was based on his lifelong problem getting words out of his mouth, whereas Trump was always just spouting random hallucinations and seemed to be completely detached from reality. Right back then, I think Trump was already further into senile dementia than Biden, and so what you're saying, certainly it matches how I see things. I do want to also say, though, when you mentioned it wasn't exactly about bags of cash, I think with TikTok, it was, in fact, about bags of cash. It was pretty widely reported that back in the second week of December in 24, when Trump was the president-elect and hadn't yet taken office, that the TikTok CEO, whose name is Xiao Zichu, went to Mar-a-Lago, stayed overnight there, had a couple days of meetings with Trump there. And I really can't see any purpose of that other than he was actually ferrying bags of cash. I think that's always the subtext. And certainly, as soon as he left, Trump was already talking about how, Biden was going to ban TikTok, but Trump was going to undo that. That was the immediately after TikTok CEO Xiao Zichu left Mar-a-Lago in December, around December 14th of 24. That was Trump's narrative. So I don't see any good reason for thinking that there weren't bags of cash.
I think on that, as well as on Biden's mental status compared to Trump's, you and I think we agree directionally, but I'm not willing to go quite as far as you are on either of those things. But in any case, it certainly is a matter of significant concern, and it should be even for Republicans who are watching, I think, Donald Trump start to destroy what was an incredibly healthy U.S. economy that he inherited. And at some point, those chickens are going to come home to roost. So, all right. You ready to move on from tariffs?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do that and talk about, another fun topic, self-deportation. This week, the Trump administration announced it will pay migrants $1,000 to self-deport. And that would be using the app that under the Biden administration allowed migrants to request asylum, CPB Home, it was called CPB One. The administration is arguing that this is a more dignified and cost-effective way to reduce the number of people in the U.S. illegally. In fact, HHS claims that the cost to arrest, detain, and deport migrants costs, on average, around a little over $17,000 per migrant. So obviously $1,000, a lot less than that. You add in travel costs and so forth. But they figure it'll save around, I think the figure I saw is 70%. And the way this would work, well, we don't know, but the payment would be made once the migrant's return to their home country has been confirmed through the app, but it's unclear as to how or when these payments would be made. And I searched a lot for this. There's no mention of it on the DHS press release. There's no mention of it in the fairly extensive FAQ on the self-deportation page. So I guess it's, you self-deport and you hope maybe that someone will send you a check or, I don't know, Bitcoin or Trump crypto for $1,000. I don't know. But Ken, what do you think? I mean, one way to look at this is if the Trump administration is just dead set on removing illegal migrants in a big way, which it seems to be, you could say, well, maybe this is, in fact, the better, more humane way to go about it than the sort of standard arrest, detain, and deport. What do you think?
Well, I think there's a lot of ifs there. First, I don't think we have any evidence that the Trump administration is interested in actually deporting people in a big way. My sense of the numbers, and I know they're always changing and there's a little bit of, they're not completely transparent, but I don't think that actual deportations, through legal processes are proceeding even at the pace that they proceeded under in the first few months of the Biden administration. I think there's deportation numbers are down, not up. And what's substituting for that is you're seeing a lot of very high profile, like kidnappings on the street and things like that, many of which are taking place, not even with deportable aliens, but with aliens who are lawfully present, like people who are here on student visas or even permanent residents with green cards, who would never have any reason to self-deport because their status is perfectly legal. They came in many cases, they came in legally on student visas, work visas, or green cards. In other cases, they may have come in without documentation, but they've already been granted asylum seeker status after they came in. So their status is in fact legal at this point. And that's who you're seeing, all the videos you see, all the news reporting, it's always on people like that who, have every right to be here. And meanwhile, the actual, there's still more than 10 million undocumented aliens in the country, but he is doing almost nothing any more than Biden ever did to actually try to use the ordinary process to deport those people, despite how he's fooling his followers about that. And on the payments, as you said, it would astonish me if anyone's ever able to collect on any of these payments, because not only has Congress never authorized that kind of appropriation, but also the Homeland Security Department is spending at basically double its budget. And I think when Secretary Noem was up at Congress testifying the other day, Senator Murphy from Connecticut pointed out to her that if she keeps spending at the pace that she is spending, the entire department's entire budget will be exhausted by late July, just a little over halfway through the year. So I don't know where the money's going to come from to be sending $1,000 payments overseas to people who don't have any easy way to either prove that they have a legal right to it or to use any kind of legal process to get it.
And I think, on first glance, you could say, well, that the argument that they make, at least on the face of it, makes sense. But when I thought about it, I think you could even make a case that it might backfire as a matter of policy. And here's what I'm thinking is, let's say you're a potential migrant from someplace like Guatemala or El Salvador. You might say, well, wait a second. So you're saying that if I can somehow manage to find my way into the U.S. and then just download this app, I can get $1,000 just basically for, to get back to my country and free travel back. That's almost in some ways could be an incentive to come to the U.S. It's obviously not what you want, right? I mean, so it doesn't make and to me,
no,
go ahead.
Although now I got to use your own line against you, Michael. I agree with the direction of what you're saying, but I think you're going too far this time. I think it would just be, think of how much of an ordeal it would try to be now. You're right. For someone from one of those countries to actually, the one thing they have been spending all this money on, they've massively increased the border security, right? So it would not be that easy
you're right.
to slip into this country without documentation. It would be a very risky thing to do, just to try to get $1,000, and it would probably cost almost that much to get up here and back for most people. I would expect a good deal more. Maybe there'd be some kind of weird deals you could work out with the smugglers, that sort of thing. Where I'll get half of your E-Verify or half of your money. But anyway, so it seems to me that if the Trump administration were really serious about changing the incentive structure, because they talked about that all the time, right? Under the Biden administration, well, the open borders, and the asylum process, it's such a great incentive and it draws people in. Well, if they were serious about changing the incentives, what they would do, I think, is they would propose national E-Verify. And they're not doing that. It's a program that's been in place since, I believe, 1990, at least the ability to use it. And on some states have it where basically if someone applies for a job, it's a database where you check to make sure that they're actually eligible, a citizen or have a green card status, that sort of thing. And it seems to me that would be a huge incentive, because if migrants get the word that, well, you won't be able to get employed in the United States, well, then what's the incentive to come here? Well, I guess avoiding persecution is one, but it removes at least a big part of that economic incentive. But there's really been I don't think there's any significant push to do that at the federal level, because
the reality of it is that we need migrants to run big parts of our economy, and everyone knows it, and they just don't want to admit that. So this whole thing just feels to me like a big smokescreen, because there's a tool that we have that we can use, that we have a pretty good idea would be at least somewhat more effective than what we have now. That's just, we're not seeing anything there. That's my take. What do you think about the E-Verify thing?
Yeah, it's a great point. I don't have data about this, so I'm just going to speculate, but I think that might be the reason why Biden was actually able to do deportations at a faster rate than Trump, because I think the Biden administration was using E-Verify some, and I also think that they were a little more willing to enforce, in sectors like agriculture, whereas it seems like Trump is totally hands off. Like if you've got, red state agricultural businesses that are relying pretty much heavily on undocumented labor, and there's no local citizen population that wants those jobs anyhow. I think you're basically seeing no deportation activity. All these slaughterhouses in Nebraska, where a lot of our beef comes from, just about everybody that works there is undocumented. And it's not, that hard to enforce in those places, but we're seeing basically no enforcement in those kind of places. And I think it's partly for the reason you said, which is that, certain sectors of our economy run on undocumented labor and couldn't run otherwise. And Trump seems to be leaving those alone. But I do think your point about E-Verify also relates to that an administration that's more willing to use that is going to have more deportations.
And there was, I think, in Florida a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was just last week, there actually was legislation, because they do have E-Verify, but there's a exemption for companies with fewer than, I want to say, 25 workers, so smaller companies basically. And there was legislation to try to change it and just make it apply to everyone. Because if you think about so many of the places where people in this country undocumented get jobs, it might be like small roofing or gardening companies or places like that. Well, that's a pretty big chunk. And if you all of a sudden make those folks actually pay people real wages with, all the kind of what you get, that would really raise their costs and then raise the cost for consumers. And especially if you take a look at what happens to these migrants, these undocumented migrants. I did a thing on this in the agricultural industry. I looked at it a few years ago. Horrible, horrible human rights abuse issues here, because essentially the employers know that they have these folks over a barrel. They can't complain or they're going to be deported, and so they're stuck here. And the way they're treated and what they're paid is just atrocious and appalling. And just if for no other reason, for a human rights concern, we should care more about this. But we don't, because we want cheap stuff.
Yep.
Any other thoughts on this pay to leave? Yeah, it made me think. Go ahead.
I will be interested. I mean, it's too early to know if anyone's going to do it, but it'll be interesting to see both if the administration claims that it's working, and then if they do claim that it's working, if they start giving out numbers of people that are self-deporting based on this, see if they can document that these payments were actually made in the same kind of numbers.
Yeah, I don't expect we'll see a lot of that. But of course, the administration, well, like all administrations, but this one more than most, claims that everything they do is working wonderfully. And if it doesn't, it's because of outside actors who are just gumming up the works. Yeah. Basically, I think it's more or less how it goes here. But all right, well, let's move on then and talk about, let's see, the states that are suing the Trump administration. There are a lot of states suing the Trump administration for a lot of reasons. In this case, I'm referring to the 19 states plus the District of Columbia that are suing the administration over Health and Human Services Department, the restructuring plan that was announced by RFK Jr. back in March. And that was a restructuring that would shrink the number of divisions in HHS from 28 to 15, eliminate around 20,000 full-time employees. Half of those would come through what are called reductions in force, which is a nice way to say mass layoffs, and half would come through voluntary retirements. That amounts to around a quarter of the entire HHS workforce. And the administration says all of this will save taxpayers around $1.8 billion per year. And in the statement announcing the lawsuit, New York State's Attorney General Letitia James, who's the taking the lead for these 19 states. She called the cuts reckless, irrational, and dangerous. Now, of course, the Trump administration, like any administration, can do plenty of things that are reckless, irrational, and dangerous that aren't actually illegal. But I think there's some pretty good grounds to argue that it's also illegal. For instance, in the lawsuit, they say, well, there's our old favorite, the Administrative Procedure Act, which the Trump administration just, I guess, pretends just doesn't even exist. But because, these changes are implemented without the required notice and comment period, they also argue that Kennedy is exceeding his statutory authority because the cuts are so significant, they make it impossible, practically impossible, for HHS to carry out its congressionally mandated functions, or at least some of them. And this represents a violation of separation of powers. The administration can't just intentionally not spend funds appropriated by Congress. And the firings were carried out without due process. So there's a lot of potentially illegal stuff there. Ken, I guess two things. One, I wonder what you think about the strength of those arguments, and then we can move on from there and talk about how you see this playing out in the district court in Rhode Island, where it was filed, as well as presumably the First Circuit, where it will be appealed to, and then potentially the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I think these arguments are slam dunk winners under current law. And so I think you will see them winning in the lower courts. I don't know what's going to happen at the Supreme Court because they're, besides my general view that the Supreme Court is somewhat corrupt, although lately they have sometimes, stood up against Trump. But in this particular area of law, even before Trump became president, this court had a project of expanding the power of Republican presidents in these kind of areas. And I'll explain that in a minute. So I do think Trump has a chance at the Supreme Court in getting lower courts reversed, but I'm sure he's going to lose in all the lower courts. And let me just go a little deeper into the issues and why I say that. So there's actually, as you laid out, there's several different sources of law that apply here. And I'll just try to keep them each a little bit separate, although I think they all point in the same direction. But one, is I want to actually mention that just the civil service statutes also, which you didn't mention, but a lot of the job functions in the government have civil service protections. So you typically have a thin layer of political appointees at the top inside all these agencies, and the political appointees have no civil service protections, and they can be fired at will by the president or by the head of the department. But that's not the majority of jobs in most of these agencies. So the rank and file career employees who stay through, as presidential administrations change, do have civil service protections. Now, that doesn't mean that they have lifetime job security, but what it does mean is if their jobs are going to be eliminated, there's really one of two types of ways that has to be generally done. One is that it has to be individual and performance related. So if a person is in a federal job and their performance is poor, they have to be notified of that first. That their performance is poor and they need to have a remediation plan. So they can't just be fired the first time anyone says. If you've got someone in a job that's been doing the job for a long time, their annual performance reviews are always good, and then they get a bad one. They can't be instantly fired based on that. That's what a civil service protection is. And the reason for that is because otherwise it would be too easy for people to be fired for political reasons that are masquerading as performance-related reasons, which is just what Trump's actually trying to do. And so they need to get a performance plan. If they're told that they're not performing well, they need to be told, what's wrong with their performance and how and what they need to do to remediate that. And then they need to have a chance to get into compliance by remediating that. And then if someone says, well, you haven't remediated it, now it's time for you to be fired. Well, then they have to have a hearing before an agency called the Merit Systems Protection Board, where the administration is going to have to prove out its claims that this person actually wasn't performing right and wasn't able to remediate. So there's a lot of straight up violation of the civil service statutes. And those are generally enforceable in court. They were generally sustained in a line of cases, but probably the most significant one is the case called Morrison versus Olson that sustained the office of the independent prosecutor against presidential termination. So you have civil service statutes. You also have, the possibility of reductions in force, which you talked about. And it is possible for an agency head to say, well, we have a job function that is now, it's not necessary to perform this job function anymore. So we don't need anyone in this job anymore. So we're eliminating the job. And that wouldn't be personally related to the, I think my answer machine's going off. I'm sorry about that. I'll talk closer to the mic. If there's a reduction in force because there's a job function that doesn't need doing anymore, that has to be noticed with a certain amount of notice, so that the agencies would have to say, this job function will be eliminated in 6 months or 12 months. And it also requires that the agency, and in fact that the government as a whole, not just the agency, try to give preferences to the good employees whose jobs are being eliminated for reduction in force because the job function doesn't need doing anymore. Those employees get preference in finding other jobs within the agency or other jobs within other agencies. So they're not just turned immediately out on the street. There's this period of time where the reduction in force takes place. They're still in the job and they're trying to land another federal job, and they get a preference for that. So none of that stuff was followed for anybody that had any kind of civil service protections, which is almost certainly the majority of all the people that have been fired, although not everybody, there are political appointees too, so they don't all get civil service protections. And then
before you move on from that, Ken, I just want to add before you move on from that, because I want to emphasize that it practically boggles my mind the extent to which the administrator, Kennedy at least, just seems to be just openly either unaware or thumbing his nose at that. I would think if you're in charge of a cabinet department, someone should give you like a little, seminar on the Administrative Procedure Act. One would hope there'd be like an onboarding. I guess there's not. But Kennedy flat out admitted that 20% of those employees that received the RIF, what's called the RIF notice, reduction in force notices, were fired in the Army. He said they shouldn't have been cut. They were. And that was always the plan. This is his. I'm quoting him. Yeah. I said, we're going to do 80% cuts, but 20% of those are going to have to be reinstated because we'll make mistakes. And he said, and we did that because we made a conscious decision at HHS to not do this individually because it would take too long and we'd lose political momentum. So, talk about that's about it. It just blows my mind.
Well, and that's what Musk had said also. Now, I want to be clear. That's actually not the Administrative Procedure Act. That's just the Civil Service statute. But that the Civil Service statutes have this process for doing reduction in force, and it does not involve immediately firing anybody. It involves having an orderly close down, during which time those applicants are still at the job that's being reduced and get preference for getting other federal jobs, so they can do a different job function that they're qualified to do. I will get to the Administrative Procedure Act. Kind of paradoxically, because I know that's getting a lot of media attention, I think that the administration does have some arguments under the Administrative Procedure Act, more than they have under the Civil Service statutes, because the Administrative Procedure Act, which is a statute that generally requires administrative agencies, if they want to do significant things, to first issue a public notice explaining the significant things that they want to do, and then to accept public comment over a period of about 90 days, where the public can comment on what it thinks of the proposal. And then, even if it moves forward to implement its own proposal after accepting public comments, it has to explain in the final order that implements the new policy why it's rejecting the counter arguments that were raised in the public comments. So none of that was complied with, but there are exceptions in the Administrative Procedure Act that arguably could apply here. There's an important exception for rules of internal agency process and procedure. So the main gist of the Administrative Procedure Act is that if an agency is going to adopt a regulation that's going to regulate an industry sector, or if it's going to rescind a regulation that's currently regulating an industry sector, that's the kind of thing that you need public notice on, because the public will be affected by that. But the usual assumption is, if agencies are just like reorganizing the bureaus, like when I was a communications lawyer, it was during the dawn of cell phones, and the FCC, they had a telecom bureau, but they didn't have a wireless telecom bureau. And so they started one, and that kind of thing, would probably generally fall under the exception to the Administrative Procedure Act. That's just the way they're organizing their internal workload. It's not something that has a direct impact on any regulated entity. It may have an indirect impact, but the indirect impact, you get the notice and comment when the new wireless telecom bureau starts actually proposing to regulations. That's when people get to make the notice and comment. So so I think that normally that there would be a little leeway to make moves like that without doing public notice and comment. The difference here, I think, is I still think the plaintiffs should win on this one, although it's less of a slam dunk, but I think it's because of the other thing you said, which is that this reorganization is so severe that it more or less guarantees that the agency will not be able to perform some of its statutorily required functions. And so if the reorganization is essentially a decision to stop doing certain things that the agency is required by statute to do, they certainly would need to take notice and comment where people could raise those arguments. But if they were thinking, well, we're just reorganizing the way we do things, we're going to run things more efficiently, but we're still going to enforce all the same regulations we were enforcing the day before, I think it would be plausible to say that the Administrative Procedure Act exception that says agency rules that reorganize internal agency process or procedure don't need to go through notice and comment rulemaking. Could properly be invoked here. So I have found it interesting that that's the one I think the news media has focused on the most, because I actually think that's the most two-sided of the arguments. But I think the civil service statutes, it's pretty one-sided. And then the due process as well, that's a constitutional doctrine under the Fifth Amendment that no one can be denied life, liberty, or property without due process. The idea that again, this relates to the civil service protections, and they often use the word tenured federal employee, which is, we're familiar with that in academia. We have tenure, but tenure exists in outside academia as well, although we usually in ordinary parlance talk about that as civil service protections, but the courts will also call that tenure protections. Anyone who's got a kind of vested property right in continuing employment, in other words, anyone who's not an at-will employee, but who has some kind of either contractual or statutory right to have continued government employment upon good behavior, or, unless there's good cause. Under the Fifth Amendment, under a very well-settled line of cases, that means that there is a right constitutionally to have due process before those kind of vested property rights in employment can be divested. So there is a constitutional overlay there. Again, that would depend on the protections being civil service protections. And the political employees probably wouldn't have that right to due process because they were never vested with those tenure protections. So there's that. And finally, the last of the arguments, I think, is just about the spending cuts, that the stated purposes of doing all this is to spend less money. But the secretaries really, there's very well settled case law that says the department heads and the president do not have the right to spend less money than was appropriated. And so I think the courts will enforce that, except for ideologically conservative lower courts that might not. If one of these cases is brought in Waco, Texas, maybe that Judge Kaczmarek won't enforce this. But most normal judges are going to enforce it because the line of precedent is so clear. And it's clear in two directions. And I think Trey and I talked about this on an earlier episode. But there's cases about can the president impound funds that Congress wants spent? And then there's other cases about can the president impound funds that Congress, actually says he can impound? And the answer to both of those questions turns out to be no. He can't impound it in either case. So that the older cases go back to the Nixon administration, and the key case is called Train versus the United States, which deals with a statute called the Impoundment Control Act. And this happened because Nixon did a lot of what Trump is now doing. Nixon, when he came in as president after Johnson, a lot of the Congress was still Democratic. A lot of the spending programs that were in place were Democratic priorities. Nixon didn't agree with a lot of them. And just like Trump, he started impounding a lot of funds. And there were some initial skirmishes where the Supreme Court initially said, well, if Congress appropriates funds, then the president, can spend up to the amount appropriated, but it's okay for him to not spend the whole amount appropriated unless Congress passes a statute directing that the whole amount must be spent, in which case he must spend it. So then after that, Congress responded by passing the Impoundment Control Act. And that's a statute that says every time we appropriate funds, we direct that it all be spent and that the president not impound any of it. And that applies to all appropriations unless a particular appropriation gives particular impoundment authority. And in Train versus United States, the Supreme Court sustained that statute against a constitutional challenge from the Nixon administration. So they've made it clear since the early 70s that Congress's general directive, which is still codified in the Impoundment Control Act, that says that funds must be spent and must not be impounded unless Congress gives specific impoundment authority for a specific line of spending. That's constitutional, enforceable, and still part of the law. And then the court went even farther than that in the 90s when the Newt Gingrich Congress actually worked with President Clinton in a bipartisan way to give Clinton a line item veto. So Congress actually enacted a line item veto act in 1996, which was briefly used and in fact briefly led to the 1997 budget being the only federal budget year in surplus since I guess since the Truman era. And so the government ran a surplus that year, not a deficit. And that wasn't only because of the line item veto, but it was a little bit because of the line item veto, because Clinton did use the line item veto a few times. And that got challenged at the Supreme Court in a case called Clinton versus New York. And there, Clinton argued, the administration argued, and I think correctly, I think I actually would side with Clinton on this, but the court didn't. But, what Clinton argued was, well, under the Train versus United States, although it generally doesn't allow me to impound funds, it does allow me to impound funds if Congress authorizes the impoundment. And here Congress authorized it under the Line Item Veto Act. These were specific items that Congress said I could line item veto out, which is another way of saying I could impound the funds, so I should be allowed to. And the court voted 6-3 that Congress couldn't even do that. They said, no, even if Congress wants to authorize impoundment of certain line items, they argued that the majority held that violated the Constitution's provisions about bicameralism and presentment, the lawmaking process, because it allowed the president to make changes to laws after he signed them into law, and that the bicameralism presentment clauses didn't allow for that even when Congress authorized it, that a change, president can never make a unilateral change to the law, even if Congress says if for this law you're allowed to make a unilateral change afterwards. So those are pretty strong precedents that really hold that all the money has to be spent. The president can't impound it against Congress's will, and the president can't even impound it with Congress's authority to impound it, which is the case. So I think those are super easy winners for the plaintiffs in these cases, but I do think that the dissenting views in those cases, are have a likelihood of actually controlling at the Supreme Court. And Train and Clinton v. New York, I think there's a reasonable chance that the Supreme Court will overrule those for Trump's benefit here. Not that they ever would have done that if Biden was still president, but I still think they'll do things to help Trump that they never would have done to help Biden.
Well, I guess I don't know if I disagree necessarily. At least if we take a look at sort of the route this is likely to take to the Supreme Court, the district court judge, Judge Jabot, she's a Biden appointee, and I expect that she's going to make the correct ruling in line with all the relevant case law precedents. Then if we take a look at the First Circuit, I didn't actually realize that all of the current 5 judges on the First Circuit are active judges, are Democratic appointees. There are like 4 Biden and 1 Obama appointee. I would expect that's going to be an easy call for them to make. And then on the Supreme Court, when I think about this particular case that gets to that point, it seems to me that there are so many reasons why they can rule against the administration that this isn't really a good, clean case on the impoundment thing. And I can see the current Supreme Court maybe wanting to give the president some impoundment authority. I don't know exactly how it's going to work out, but this does not seem to me to be the best vehicle for this, I think they'd be a lot more likely to say, well, no, it's not okay on these various other grounds, all the other grounds that you mentioned, and we don't even have to address the impoundment issue. What do you think of that take?
It's possible, but I think that one thing is that lately Chief Justice Roberts has certainly people on the right think that he's like anti-MAGA, that he's gone too far to the left, that he's a woke Chief Justice or something, and it could almost make you forget that he's in fact very conservative and would have been considered very conservative by the standards of, anybody but the Trumpers, for most of the time he was on the court. Certainly he was considered that by G.W. Bush, who appointed him. And one of the ways that Roberts is, in fact, still very conservative by traditional conservative metrics, even though maybe he doesn't always align with MAGA on everything, he really is for a very strong fiscal unitary executive. He always has been. He cut his teeth in the Reagan Justice Department working for Ed Meese. He's in favor of things like impoundment authority. And I agree with you that if this case presents other significant legal problems, maybe he won't use this as a method to move forward the impoundment issue. But I think I do think that there's a majority of the conservative justices on the court, including Roberts, including the justices that today we would think of as center right, that really, wouldn't think that Train versus United States or Clinton versus New York were correctly decided and would be looking for a vehicle to overrule those.
Yeah, I agree with that, certainly. I'd be surprised if that doesn't happen at some point. I just don't think there are so many. I mean, there are a number of other cases and I think are they might be on stronger grounds where they can focus more directly on that. But we'll see going forward. Anything else on this, Ken?
No, I think that's pretty much it.
Well, with that, why don't we wind things up? And if you want to get in touch with us to hold forth on what Ken or what I said, there are a lot of ways to do that. Mail at politicsguys.com, Facebook or X. We always put links in the show notes. Our Discord discussion forum for supporters. I'm on that all the time, and so we'd love to hear from you. And and if you are a supporter and you're interested, or if you're not a supporter, and you're interested in becoming part of that Discord group, that would be great. There are a bunch of other benefits as well. We hope you checked it out. The biggest benefit, as far as we're concerned, is that enables us to keep on doing what we've been doing, and we rely very strongly on your support, your financial support for that. So we hope you'll consider that if you haven't already. And again, support links are always in the show notes, and Patreon, PayPal. I guess you could come visit me over the weekend and bring me bags of cash. That will work too. So I'm okay with that. But and if you do want to get our full midweek show, which supporters get as opposed to just that 15-minute snippet, but you're not financially able to support us at this point, just let me know. You can send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really helps us out a lot if you subscribe, rate, and review us on your podcast app, and if you share episodes on social media. And as always, before we go, I want to send out a very special thank you to our executive producing team, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,